Thank you to everyone joining us today from across the country and around the world. I'm Kim Todd, Virtual Programs Manager here at Conscious Capitalism, Inc. On behalf of the entire CCI team, we appreciate you taking the time to learn and grow in community with us. Today, we are excited to welcome Christian Steiner, CEO of Helvetas USA, to discuss how the public and private sectors can work together to elevate humanity, address and meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and create a better world for all. As many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of business, as well as a movement of business leaders from around the world working to change the practice and perception of capitalism as a means to elevate humanity. Conscious Capitalism, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement by creating learning opportunities like today's session and building systems of support for practicing conscious capitalists through our Senior Leader Network membership and engagement with our local chapters. Several times a month, we offer virtual gatherings as a way for the community to see how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and the business practices of those in our network. Today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. We will be in conversation with Christian for approximately 25 minutes, and then we'll transition to audience questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of our session. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can during our time together. If you have any technical questions or issues, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org. And now I'm honored to introduce Christian Steiner. He is the CEO of Helvetas USA, a position that he assumed in 2018. Driven by his passion for lifting the world's poorest people up and out of poverty, over the last 20 years, he has held executive management positions in development cooperation in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Mozambique, Kyrgyzstan, and Madagascar. Christian has led teams in the design and management of multi-stakeholder programs funded by USAID, Europe Aid, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, and the Swiss Development Cooperation, as well as many private foundations and corporations. A native German speaker, Christian is also fluent in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and English. Christian, thank you so much for being with us today. We're happy to have you here so we can learn more about you and the work of Helvetas USA.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. Well, I gave the very abbreviated version of your background, but I'd love for you to share just a little bit more about yourself and what made you choose international development as your career.
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you. I grew up on a farm in Switzerland, so really learning the work of farming and being close to entrepreneurial development of rural enterprises. And then when I studied agronomy and I learned about the field of international development, I just realized how much potential, but also need there is in developing agricultural value chains. So I started out with a job in the coffee sector, working for the private sector in the Dominican Republic, still loved the coffee from there, and gradually learned about the needs and opportunities of development, cooperation and poverty reduction, and that got me into this career that you briefly outlined.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for sharing that. And I do know that Helvetas is very well known in Europe and throughout the rest of the world, but maybe not so much in the United States. For those that don't know about the important work that Helvetas is doing globally, can you provide a brief overview of the organization's mission and its impact?
Absolutely. So Helvetas was the first development NGO created in Switzerland, founded in 1955. And is now the largest Swiss organization of this kind, with an annual budget of a bit more than $150 million a year, working in almost 40 countries, implementing 300 projects. And we do have this sister office here in the US, which I joined 4 years ago to really build relationships with US allies and partners that join us in the mission to support poor and disadvantaged people in low and middle income countries to improve their living conditions. We basically have three approaches to our work. One is ensuring basic rights of people, but then also creating opportunities, economic opportunities for youth through skills development, and working on the good governance of systems, so whatever we do in development work is sustainable. In this work, we very much believe that the private sector engagement is essential to reach the sustainable development goals. And I have had the pleasure in different roles and functions to work with private sector. And maybe to illustrate that a bit, I could mention two examples. One is from our humanitarian aid, where we are all concerned about the situation in Ukraine and the war. And we have a presence in some neighboring countries like Moldova, where we work helping vulnerable people fleeing the war, such as elderly, people with disabilities, people with young children, to find support. So what we do in these refugee camps is support with access to SIM cards and internet access, so people can communicate with their relatives, organize their journey, and some children, even through internet access, continue their education. So for this kind of work, private sector is a key partner for internet access, for the technology, for providing these tools. And we're very happy and proud to be a member of NETO, which is a network that brings together 60 NGOs like Helvetas and more than 70 tech partners to really work together and collaborate through funding, but also through technical support in these kind of emergency contexts. When we look at the development world, another example I could mention is the collaboration of private sector in the very much projects where we work on water supply and access to clean drinking water for rural communities, where we have in several African countries an approach where the private sector comes in as a project partner and builds and manages water system like the one shown on this picture, solar pumped reservoirs, which then distribute water through pipelines to the different households. And the private sector's role is in building these systems, but then also in running and maintaining them for periods of 15, 20 years of lease contract with the municipalities. And this really allows to have a market-based approach that ensures the sustainability and long-term solution of such investments for the benefit of the community. So just to illustrate these as two practical examples of how we work together with private sector partners in addressing the needs of people in need.
Wow, what great examples. And you mentioned the importance of working with the private sector on these projects, as far as the technology and the investment funds to get things built. Does Helvetas and the private sector also work with those local communities to provide jobs and training? Does that help keep those projects sustainable?
Very much so. So one of our practice areas is skills development, workforce development, in which we support market systems solution, in which job training and skilling of youth is very much linked to the labor market demands. So we do have examples, for example, in Ethiopia with the Sky project, where we have a results-based funding system where private sector takes on the training and gets paid for youth, not only for passing the training and skills tests, but then also for job placement and the level of salary they make. So private sector, both as an actor in the training systems, but then also as a partner in informing what kind of training, what kind of skills are needed in the labor market, is the key essential part in these programs. Absolutely.
Wonderful. And I know, in trying to alleviate and end poverty, a major focus is working with women and girls, because in many developing countries, they bear the brunt of economic disadvantages. Can you explain a little bit more about some of the programs you have to help elevate women and girls around the world?
So I just mentioned the results-based payment system, in which training providers get paid based on the number of youth that pass the test, but then also part of the payment based on how many of the trained youth get access to jobs and how many of them make more than the minimum wage. So in these results-based payment systems, we have incentives that we can create for the number of young girls that are being trained. So really creating an additional payment scheme to incentivize the training providers to seek job seekers, young girls, women that need access and want training. And in some cases, we even take that way further and not only incentivize the training of young women, but young women of minority groups, of remote areas. So you can have leverages through these incentive payment systems that really help those training provisions to be geared and focused on those groups that are most in need.
Wonderful.
Maybe to put a number on this, we had a program in Nepal which used that system that trained more than 100,000 youth, and we had more than 75% of those in jobs placed after the training. So very high numbers that shows that these financial incentive systems really work to improve the efficiency of training. And that's the important role that the private sector brings in.
Wonderful. That is, those numbers are amazing. And to kind of elaborate more on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, obviously poverty and economic advancement is a huge focus. The climate and climate change, disaster resistance, resilience, also something that everyone around the world is dealing with right now. What we've seen in Pakistan recently with the major flooding, actually major flooding here in the United States as well. Can you speak a little bit about some of the focus that Helvetas is working on when it comes to climate change and disasters?
Mm-hmm. Maybe starting a bit with the Sustainable Development Goals, and maybe we can briefly show them on a slide. They really inform the kind of work we do, the priorities, and these 17 goals are focused on improving the lives of world people. And it really is a good summary of what is needed. And they include aspirations such as ending poverty, improving education, and reducing inequality. So a lot of the number one goal, ending poverty, is really at the groundwork. And I chose one picture of a group of children to illustrate the impact of poverty. You see on a picture a number of children that, picture is not yet showing on my screen. Here it's coming.
Yeah, we can see the picture.
A number of 8-year-olds that are clearly, just that my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're cutting out a little bit, but we can hear you now.
Okay. What you see on these pictures is a group of 8-year-old children that are stunted in their growth. So they're smaller in their size than they should be if child development would follow through its potential. And the reason for this is many things, but mostly it's lack of access to clean drinking water, which then causes diarrhea, which causes malnutrition, often in environments in which food security is per se not very good. And as a consequence, a lot of these children do not fully develop their physical and mental abilities in their life. And if this happens at a young age, it's very hard to because water is such essential part of drinking water. Everything we see right water, we see Pakistan affecting the access to clean drinking water, affecting the food production cycles, and affecting, if it's the whole number of children that are not developing their full potential, the long-term outlook of societies, all the way to the point that it is deadly. The number of children you see on this picture is the number of children that die 3-4 hours in Madagascar due to malnutrition. It's 50 children of that age that die every day. So it's really a heavy burden on societies, and climate change makes this more difficult now with the irregularity of water, which now often is either too much or too little in many contexts.
Yes, very stark numbers. And you mentioned water being a major issue globally, either too much or lack of clean water, accessible water. And I know that Helvetas has worked with another example of private sector cooperation with Mars on a big water project. Would you like to share a little bit more about that project and the impact?
Yes, I would love to use the topic of water to illustrate a little bit how private sector and development cooperation can join forces and come together, because it's a topic that we are all concerned and we all increasingly become aware of, because it's not only in poorer countries and contexts that water scarcity, drought, or floods are affecting our everyday lives. So a lot of companies realize this at the level of their supply chains. And maybe starting with, I'm coming to Mars, but starting with another company that we work with, Linked, the chocolate company, has a foundation in terms of funding access to drinking water systems for rural communities that produce cocoa as a way to give back to the communities and help fight poverty and improve livelihoods. So that's a wonderful way of collaborating with a private company that has a foundation, does charitable work, giving back to the communities from which they supply their resources. But then observing how climate change affects the water household, the water resource management in these communities, it became evident that with the annual rainfall not being so much distributed anymore, but coming down in extreme events, hurricanes in which in 2 days you get the rainfall of 2 months, there is a lot of water runoff, which superficially destroys a lot of the infrastructure and causes a lot of damage, all the way to the loss of human life, like we now see in Pakistan at a horrible level. But there's also another long-term effect, that the runoff water does not infiltrate the soil and does not fill up the groundwater level. So what we see in the long term is that the groundwater level in these areas goes down. And in the concrete case of the cocoa value chain, it means that the trees, the roots, don't reach the water, they suffer water stress, they reduce production, all the way to drying out and losing entire areas of supply chain production areas. And that's when the collaboration with Lind evolved into being a business partnership in which we really developed together a climate resilient cocoa landscape project, looking at how can the water household be managed locally, reforesting, helping the water flow to reduce the runoff, building gray infrastructure to slow down the water, building green infrastructure like reforestation areas where the water can infiltrate, and really have that long-term vision. And what we see in companies that partner up with us to work with communities that are also part of the supply chain is really this long-term interest. A company that wants to sell chocolate is interested to source cocoa for the next 50 years if they want to stay in business. So you have this long-term vision into sustainability that many of the private sector partners that work with us bring to the table, and which often is a strength, even if you compare it to the local authorities with whom we work, but that often work in these election cycle periods, that the next 4 years, next 5 years until re-election, and often topics that take much longer to show results are more difficult. And we see the private sector more and more as a engaged partner in this long-term sustainability, because the supply chains depend on this. And coming to Mars, we have had a wonderful collaboration with Mars and several other companies working on 2 of the crops that use most water. It might not be known to everybody, but 70% of water is used by agriculture. So with more and more water insecurity and water scarcity, we need to look at how water is used and what can be done about it. And with agriculture being the big user of water, it's a logical entry point. And within agriculture, there's 2 crops that take the largest share of all this water. It's cotton and it's rice. So Mars is one of our partners looking at how to reduce the water footprint in rice production. And we have had this water productivity program now in 6 countries for 8 years, working with different local contexts, different communities, reaching over 65,000 farmers in these supply chains, being supported to reduce the amount of water used to produce the produce. And we could, overall, the project reduce water usage by 20%, in some cases up to 50%, just by better training, better knowledge on what can be done technically. And it can be sometimes very, very simple. When you do irrigation of a field, instead of every furrow, you can irrigate every second furrow, make shorter furrows, and with small adaptations, you can reduce the amount of water that is needed for the same level of production. So these are areas where private sector partners are very key to help us reach the communities, reach the supply chains, and work with them, but then also take it all the way to the consumer level and educate the consumer about water sustainability, about ecological footprints. There's different labels that different companies adhere to, standards that they subscribe to, that show to the consumer the level of sustainability of what they're purchasing. And it's really very important to find partners that are interested to work both on the supply chain, but then also in their market, in their access to the consumer, to educate the consumer and subscribe to long-term sustainability. And I used Lind and I used Mars as examples because they have been wonderful partners really addressing issues around natural resource management and specifically about how to reduce water footprints. And I believe there is potential for many more companies and many more households and many more individuals to really look into this, become aware of these issues, and each and every one do our part to help address the climate challenge that we have in front of us as human societies.
Yeah, those are some great partnerships and really, really great work. For companies that might be starting on this journey of, ESG or the environmental sustainable development and governance, folks who might not be super invested yet, do you have any tips or advice on, how to get started, how to kind of wrap into your corporate values more of these UN Sustainable Development Goals and see things kind of on this larger scale? Sometimes when we're here locally, either running our business or just living in our own local communities, we may not take into account kind of that global footprint. Do you have any tips or advice for companies and or people that are starting to be a little bit more concerned about this?
Yes, conscious capitalism is of course a very nice example of where you can join like-minded organizations and inform yourself, which is a very important part, to be curious, to be invested into and learn about it. And the Sustainable Development Goals are a good entry point just to inform yourself about the needs and what are the issues that are being addressed and what are the goals that we as humans have set to achieve and to which we all want to contribute and need to contribute if we want to achieve them by 2030. So information, understanding, and true commitment is very important. We do, as a nonprofit, carefully conduct the due diligence with the private sector partners we work with, because it has to be a true commitment. It has to be a real concern about sustainability and not a greenwashing exercise just to put a nice marketing material out there. So this is very important, that you're committed and truthful about it. And then there's different levels to start addressing. I think one is to your own staff, incentivize, give space to discuss topics, give feedback loops where issues that can be improved can be addressed and can be supported also by the business leaders. And then there's, of course, the opportunity to support organizations like Helvetas or like-minded other organizations that do similar work on a regional, on a local, on a global level. And this support can take different forms. I mentioned one of the companies that has a foundation that gives financial support as a charitable giving back to the communities that are part of the supply chain, all the way to really investing into what is our sustainability in our supply chains look like, where can we make improvements, and seek partnerships and invest in joint projects where we identify a win-win on shared goals. And then to the business leaders that listen to conscious capitalism talks, many nonprofits such as Helvetas USA also look for board members that can help shift and guide strategies of how nonprofits can evolve and collaborate with private sectors. So there's also an opportunity to personally invest in supporting nonprofits to scale and learn from the expertise and networks that business leaders can bring to the board.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. I know we do have some questions popping up in the Q&A box. For everybody who's on the call, go ahead and use that Q&A box to submit your questions. And since you did mention it a little while ago, and there is a question in the chat, I'm going to just turn to a question about due diligence. You mentioned that it needs to be a true partnership and private sector needs to be committed. The question is, how do you apply due diligence to choose which corporations to work with? For example, you spoke about children stunting, a problem as big as that with children obesity globally. And nonetheless, you'll work with companies who are mass sellers of chocolate or oversweetened products. How do you kind of monitor or manage, the goals and who you're going to be working with?
I mentioned the true commitment, and I think in the end of the due diligence, it really comes down to, do we have shared goals? Do we find a common denominator in which we want to improve things together? Nobody's perfect, so we understand there's challenges on the way of these kind of collaborations. But from the outset, there needs to be a clear understanding of what are the goals that we agree on and want to work towards and improve towards them. And then transparency in the relationship is very important in terms of the communication, because it, in the end, is a trust-building exercise where you want to have an open dialogue, you want to be able to give feedback, and you want to eventually have an openness also to review certain practices that might not be sustainable and you would want to improve them. So it needs that level of common partnerships. We do have in our due diligence, of course, some exclusion factors. Private sector companies with whom we do not work because they are in areas or sectors which we don't think are beneficial for society, and they are excluded. And then if these exclusion factors do not apply, and if we identify that there's no major risk of greenwashing or corruption in the collaboration, that there's a real long-term investment being made, then we enter a dialogue. But in some partnerships that are more critical, we would, example, stay away from receiving funding from the partner, just collaborate on a technical level, on a policy development level, but not accept funding from some of the partners we work with. So we would maintain our independence and really be a sounding board and advisor, and not become a party that has a conflict of interest because we're also funded by these entities. So there's different levels of the due diligence that we carefully look at to identify what kind of partnership. The sector is a very big group. So from the local construction firm that builds and runs a water management system, all the way to a global corporation that reviews its global footprint, it's a big stretch. So due diligence has to be adapted to the needs of every context.
Great. Thanks for that. And in setting up those goals, do you and the private sector, are you each managing the impact and the goals, or is that something that Helvetas is doing, making sure that you are meeting those objectives? Is the impact and the measurement also a collaboration, or does private sector rely on Helvetas to make sure that things are going according to plan?
There's of course a big spectrum in terms of the monitoring and evaluation of the work, and it depends really on the role of the private sector. Is this a value chain actor that is, and in those cases, like say setting up a traceability system for a supply chain, this is very much run by the private sector itself, in which we can contribute and we inform the systems, and in many cases we would have access to some of the data to inform how it can be improved. And for example, concretely in the traceability system, which farmers have got support in terms of sustainability techniques for their production systems, which ones not yet. So we would have a jointly owned and informed monitoring system of the benefits of the training that goes out to those farmers. Whereas in some relationships, we would receive funding from a private company to provide access to clean water as a benefit to the community. And in those examples, it would be very much mandated to us to do the monitoring and evaluation and report back to the private partner, who in this setup is a funder. In this kind of system, the monitoring evaluation is often done together with local authorities, local community leaders, and it's a good practice. We have every 4-5 years to do an external evaluation to validate our data from some independent party that can then do an external impact evaluation of this kind of work. Great,
thanks for that. A couple more questions that have come in. One from Bernard, and I think we maybe answered this a little bit, but the question is, what benefits does the private sector get out of these collaborations, other than a sense of feeling good about helping others? Is there a financial benefit for them? Is there, what are some of the benefits that the private sector can see with these collaborations?
There is, of course, the benefit of doing good in the world, which I believe is a high target. And that's something that can make your workforce appreciate you as an employer, because a lot of people, especially the younger generations, really care about their impact they have in the world and who they work for and what the company does. So it comes down to really being also a good HR policy to commit to sustainability and do good and provide that added benefit to your workforce. But then it's also very often just a sound business strategy to engage in sustainable business and sell products that respond to the challenges, because the same generations that care about their personal impact are also the consumers that make choices in what they buy. And very often we see that these sustainable markets offer better prices and offer better margins to companies that work on these sectors and develop those as their target, that they can do both good and good business. And I think that is the win-win, where we see that there's opportunities, not in all sectors to the same level, but certainly opportunities to respond to changing market demands and changing awareness of us all as consumers.
Great, excellent answer. And there is another question that came in about, the positive impact of these collaborations on the environment, the economic impact of providing jobs and training for communities. Does Helvetas also work on social issues, racial injustice, any of these kind of more policy issues that impact people around the world. Do you have any impact stories about those issues that you can share?
Yes, very much so. It was a bit fast in the beginning when I showed the practice areas, where I said we have one area that is really about basic rights. And under this category would be the access to clean drinking water and the stunted growth because of malnutrition and all these issues that need to be addressed. And then we talked briefly about job opportunities for youth, market entry, labor market. And the third area, and we didn't talk that much about it, is the good governance part, which is the key aspect. In the end, it's all about good governance. The development challenges we look at and we work on are often not of technical nature. The technical nature is the easier part. The solution to a technical problem can be found and applied rather quickly, but it's the governance of it. It's the systems, it's the power sharing. And very often when it comes to good governance practices, it's about sharing power. When it's about resource management, it's about who gets to decide what resources is used by whom. I mentioned that 70% of water is used in agriculture, and with increasing water pressure, there's increasing conflict potential around who gets access to water. And I think it's a reality that we live, reservoirs are depleting, and there's more and more restrictions coming on how water is being used. In this sense, an important aspect of our primary stakeholders in advocating for their needs and for their rights. And we have a beautiful example, staying on the topic of in Central Asia, where we have helped water user associations, farmers that need water for their livelihoods in irrigation, to organize around water allocation and bring up demands and needs for improving of the efficiency of irrigation systems, all the way to the national government, who very recently developed a new irrigation water resource management law that took up these requirements from the water users in the field. So bringing people together, bringing stakeholders together, organizing them and supporting them in their advocacy towards decision makers is a very important part, and is a key aspect of the power relationships and the conflict management around scarce resources that in the end are crucial for the sustainability of the kind of development cooperation that we're doing.
Great, thanks for that. And we are coming up at about 5 minutes left. So for folks who have any other questions, feel free to add into the chat. I wanted to just bring up something that I saw on the Helvetas website that I thought was interesting and also relevant to conscious leaders. It mentioned that Helvetas promotes learning in different ways, for example, through creating an environment that values and rewards learning and knowledge sharing. So you're focusing on storytelling, to tell your story, as well as receiving information from others. Can you share a little bit more about how you create that environment that makes it safe, to share stories and receive information?
Absolutely. I think a lot of development does not happen by design, but by evolution. It's small learnings that are fed through feedback loops of what works, and that's how life has evolved, through small adjustments. And I very much believe in the feedback loops and in the need of continuous development through evolution. And in that sense, we try to build these into the systems of the monitoring and evaluation work that we do, and the project design work we do, that we get the feedbacks from the primary stakeholders, from the partners, of what worked, what did not work, and regularly review and adjust the designs and the projects respond to these learnings. And I think this is a key part that many businesses, of course, also integrate into their development to always stay on top of it. One way of doing this in relation to the private sector collaboration and engagement is that at the end of a program like the water productivity program that we developed together with Mars, we now have a full year of really collecting and documenting the learnings. And these are the learnings from local authorities' perspectives, from farmers' perspectives, from the private partner perspectives. And we bring these together, we document them, we share them with each other to understand each other's perspectives and learnings in the processes, to come to applicable operational solutions, conclusions out of these learnings. We will have in November a symposium that is a public event that Helvetas organizes with the private sector partners to publicly discuss the outcomes and impacts of this kind of programs and what we learned in collaborating from each other. Because we talked about the learnings and the approach of us as a nonprofit working with private sector, but there's of course also learnings from the private sectors and how to engage with nonprofits in the supply chain and what added perspective and value they bring in. So fostering this kind of open dialogue and having joint events like the symposium later this year are key moments. And of course, it takes a lot of groundwork to distill and document the learnings so we can make them shareable and hopefully make them available to a larger community that can also benefit from these investments and these findings.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Christian, for being here with us today and sharing about the amazing work that Helvetas is doing, the amazing partnerships and collaboration with the private sector, so many opportunities to elevate humanity and create this better world. A lot of challenges ahead, but it's good to see that people are working together to address these challenges. Want to thank everybody else for joining us today. Thank you for your time, for being here with us to learn a little bit more. If you are new to conscious capitalism, we encourage you to visit our website to learn a little bit more about what we have to offer. We hope to see you at some of our other events. We'll go ahead and drop a chat or in the chat a link to our website. We host these virtual gatherings every month on various topics. We'd love to see you there. We also would love to get your feedback. I dropped in the chat a very brief survey to hear your feedback to help us with future programming. Christian, once again, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to more collaboration. Thank you for having me, and congrats, and thank you for all the work you do. It's super important. Appreciate it. Thank you. Well, we hope everybody enjoys their day. Thanks for joining us.